Welcome back, Focus Learners. Today we've got an absolutely fascinating explainer lined up for you. We're going to dive into the details of a highly specialized training module, and it's called Explosive into Fear. Okay, let's dive into this. We're going to break down this incredible framework. It's designed to map exactly how a sudden violent external event translates into a really complex internal emotional response. Basically, it's about bridging that gap between a literal physical explosion and the psychological shockwave that instantly follows it.
Now, everything we're discussing today is deeply anchored in one core excerpt straight from the module's documentation. It goes like this. In this module, the participants would look at the first impact of explosives to fear. The participants would also learn the psychology of fear, especially how the fear happened, and create a stronger sense of awareness of all these emotions. Think of that text as our exact map for today's explainer. It literally outlines the entire journey from a physical trigger all the way to internal emotional mastery. And, we're going to unpack every single layer of this over the next few minutes.
Let's move to and see how this builds, because by dissecting this text, we can clearly see the curriculum is structured into three very distinct phases that participants go through. First up, they look at the impact, and we're talking about the immediate, visceral, real-world reality of an explosion. Second, they learn the psychology. That's the underlying science of what is actually happening inside the brain and body. And third, they create awareness. This establishes a clear logical path from a terrifying external threat right to a profound internal realization.
Let's zoom in on that very first phase. The text uses a super specific phrase here, the first impact of explosives to fear. Just imagine, for a second, the sheer suddenness of an event like that. We are talking about a physical catalyst that shatters the baseline of normal reality in literally a fraction of a second. The module doesn't just ask participants to think about fear in some theoretical vacuum. No, it roots the origin of this fear in a violent, concussive, real-world event. That first impact is the physical shockwave itself. It's that intense, overwhelming sensory overload of sound, pressure, and chaos that forces the human nervous system into an immediate, involuntary, and absolute reaction.
And this brilliantly illustrates the core dichotomy sitting right at the heart of this entire module. On one hand, you have the external catalyst, the tangible physical reality of the blast. But then we immediately pivot to the deeply internal mechanism, the psychology of fear. The training really forces participants to recognize something crucial. While the explosion happens outside the body, the fear itself is an entirely mental reaction occurring within. Think about that. The blast doesn't actually contain fear. The blast triggers the human mind to manufacture it. Understanding that strict, hard boundary between the chaotic external world and the internal mind is an absolutely crucial step in taking control.
So once that boundary is crossed, what exactly is happening on the inside? Well, we move away from the smoke and the noise of the physical world, and we step directly into the intricate, underlying mechanics of the human mind. The text explicitly states that participants learn the psychology of fear. By framing fear as an internal mechanism, the module is aiming to completely demystify the terror. It takes a feeling that is usually just overwhelming and chaotic and turns it into a structured, biological, and psychological process. A process that can actually be studied, predicted, and ultimately understood.
Now, what's really interesting about this slide is the exact phrasing, how the fear happened. Notice the past tense there? That's not an accident. The module treats fear not just as some random amorphous feeling that washes over you out of nowhere, but as a traceable sequence of events with a clear beginning, middle, and end. It is a distinct psychological process. The whole point of the training is to equip participants with the ability to look back at an explosive impact and trace the exact internal mechanics of their emotional response. They literally learn to identify the precise millisecond that sensory input morphed into psychological panic.
Which brings us to the third and final step of this incredible psychological journey, the conscious mind. The source text concludes by stating that the module helps participants create a stronger sense of awareness of all these emotions. Once you've survived that first impact, and once you've intellectually understood the mechanics of how the fear happened, the final stage is pure, grounded awareness. It's really about stepping out of that reactive, primitive animal brain. It's about not letting the fear control you, but rather holding those intensely powerful emotions right there in your conscious mind and acknowledging them clearly without being totally overtaken by them.
So the crucial point is really captured when we review the overarching trajectory of this training. You analyze the first impact, you learn the psychology, you understand how the fear happened, and finally, you create that stronger sense of awareness. When you look at the whole picture, you can see this isn't merely a tactical survival course, it's a deep dive into psychological resilience. Recognizing these emotions, actually naming them, mapping them out, and predicting them is the ultimate tool for personal mastery when you're facing extreme explosive stress.
And this brings us to a really powerful place to wrap up our explainer today. The module fundamentally takes participants from the terrifying, raw chaos of an explosion to a state of profound emotional clarity. But I want to leave you with a question to ponder in your own life, even if you never face literal explosives. Once we understand how fear happens, how does that awareness change us? Because whether the sudden impacts in our lives are physical or emotional, if we can trace the internal mechanics of our own fear, we take our power back. Self-awareness becomes our greatest shield. Thank you so much for joining me for this detailed explainer. Keep analyzing, keep learning, and I'll see you next time.